We are, starting in with chapter 2 and parts of chapter 3. The two templates for American culture and America in general are what happened in Massachusetts with the Puritans and what happened in Virginia. And those chapters are chronological, mixed together. I am separating them out and starting with everything to do with Massachusetts because the segue from religion is perfect here. Without understanding the Puritans, you cannot understand America because they had a profound influence and still do. At the time of the Revolution, 1 out of 3 Americans called themselves a Calvinist, and Puritans were Calvinists. Okay, so who are the Calvinists? If you go back to that branching tree that we talked about, that religious tree, the Protestants are protesting Catholic doctrine that they don't like. And the Protestants immediately, when you begin to read the Bible, everybody can have their own interpretation. And what happened with Protestantism is that it immediately began to split. One of the first splits was with John Calvin in Switzerland, and later on he went to Scotland and England. John Calvin began the Calvinists. Puritans and Pilgrims were Calvinists. They are a branch of Protestantism. They had their own take on it. And that first slide in there basically outlines Puritan theology. If you want a simple hashtag with that, predestination. So Puritans, Pilgrims, predestination, 3 P's to remember there. So Puritan theology, Calvinist theology, the Puritans were English Calvinists. There were Calvinists in other places. These were the English Calvinists. They wanted to purify or correct the doctrines of the Anglican Church, which they thought was very corrupt. So if you are a Calvinist or a Puritan, you believe that God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing. He's not necessarily the good, positive God that we see today. For the Puritans and the Calvinists, God was a smack you down if you get out of line God. Okay? He knows all. He controls all. God is in charge of everything. He is all-powerful and all-knowing. This makes sense if you think about the time they're living in, because there were many things that could not be explained. This is before the rise of science. There's no explanation for anything. God did it, was the explanation. Okay, so if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, they still believed in the Bible and the New Testament and salvation, but it is God who determines everything in your life. It is God who determines your fate. Okay? He determines who's going to be saved and go to heaven or who's going to be damned to hell. And God knows this before you are even born. This is the doctrine of predestination, which nobody believes in today, but which they strongly supported. If God knows everything, then he knows before you're born if you're going to go to heaven or hell. He knows your destiny. You are predestined, according to the Calvinists, to go to heaven or hell, and only God knows. You do not know. God knows. This is a big jump for us, and this is the hard part of the Puritans. There is no free will, which of course we believe in strongly today. Whatever you do, however you lead your life, is completely irrelevant if you believe that God is all-powerful and all-knowing. Nothing you do, no apologies that you make, you cannot bribe, you cannot deal with God. And if you think you're saved, you're probably not, because that is pride and that is also a sin. So I always laugh when I see bumper stickers that say, honk if you love Jesus, because a Puritan would immediately say, that person is damned. He thinks that he's saved, but he's probably not. So predestination is the hashtag for the Puritans. And another corollary to this is only a very few people will be saved. Most of us are going to fry in hell. Only a small percentage, less than 10%, would be saved. God doesn't pass out salvation easily. Okay, second point, man is by nature evil. Why? If you look at the Bible, the Old Testament, the sin of Adam and Eve, In Adam's fall, we sinned all. Evil walks in our world. There are evil people, there are evil witches, etc. These are all signs from God. So you have to be very careful, because anywhere you go, anybody you talk to may be the devil in disguise. This is a pretty grim theology, by the way. You can tell right away because you're scratching your head now. Anne Bradstreet, our first American female poet, probably our first American poet, a very good Puritan mother, had a dozen kids, only lost one child. So she was clearly a very diligent and very good mother. Wrote a poem to her infant daughter, one of her daughters that was born, and this is what the poem said. So you are looking down at your infant child, and this is what Anne Bradstreet, as a good Puritan, wrote. Man is at best a creature frail and vain, stained from birth with Adam's sinful fact. I began to sin as soon as act, a perverse will to love what is forbid, a serpent's sting in pleasing face lay hid. So you're looking at your newborn infant daughter. What do you see? Serpent, evil thing, you are going to grow up and bite me and kill me. Because they believed all men, or almost all men, were born evil. This is a big jump for us today. It's just hard to get your head around it. Of course, none of us believe this anymore, but they did. The world was a pretty grim place for the Puritans. If that is true, if you believe in predestination, man is born evil, the Bible is the source of all truth and the ultimate authority in everything. And they meant literally true. So if the earth was created in 7 days, then we're talking 7 24-hour days. Whatever the Bible said, that was the truth, because that was God's word written down. So if you wanted to determine how people should act or a society should be arranged, you went to the Bible. The importance of this, of course, is that every person, the only way you could achieve salvation was through reading the Bible. Number one job of Puritan parents was to teach their children to read. Their salvation depended on it. That was your number one duty. Before feeding them, you had to feed their mind. You had to teach them literacy. This is a very rational, intellectual religion. You don't find God through your emotions. You find him through reading and contemplating and studying. It's not surprising that the Puritans and early the Massachusetts colony had twice the literacy rate of Britain, and Britain was one of the more literate places in the world. This was required for church membership. Not everybody who lived in Massachusetts was a church member after the first maybe decade or two, but anybody who wanted to be saved had to be a church member. Church was a serious occupation, pretty much all day Sunday, and usually another evening at least during the week, usually on a Thursday. Their laws are made, their society is governed by biblical laws, not English common law. So the Bible was the key thing. In their services, and you have a picture of the Ship Church in Hingham, Massachusetts. My son happens to live in Hingham. I've actually been in that church, not for a sermon, but I've been there. It's a really interesting church. During their sermons, their ministers had to be well educated, had to know the Bible backwards and forwards, because remember, their congregation also had read and knew the Bible. Unlike Catholics, who were largely, not all, but often illiterate and depended on the priest to teach them and to translate for them, in Puritan churches, everybody's literate. And they would get up and argue with the minister. Wait a minute, doesn't it say such and such? I don't think you're interpreting that right. And if that's true, what about this story here in this part of the Bible? They could challenge ministers. You did not challenge priests in Catholic churches too often. If you did, you usually were thrown out. So this is a very mental, literal interpretation of the Bible, which is important, and their society is based on biblical laws. Another difference between the Calvinist and other Protestant churches like the Lutheran Church, In the Calvinist church, because they're so strongly connected to biblical laws, the church can and should direct society. And I'm quoting from a Calvinist Puritan sermon. Take government from the face of the earth, and men would become cutthroats and cannibals. Savage cruelties would overflow all countries. It is absolutely necessary to have civilian government. You have to have it. Pure democracy might be a little dangerous to Puritans because not everybody was saved. Not everybody in Massachusetts was a Puritan, although most were. Who voted and who got to vote in civil elections were church members, and they met constantly. Each little town had its own self-governing church. What you did in your congregation and your church may be different and have slightly different beliefs than the town next door. This is where the term congregationalists come up. Every church, every town controlled its own affairs and sometimes its own religious teachings. There were minor variations. They met regularly, they made laws, and they made laws for lots of little things because control was important. If man is evil by nature, then it is important for society to make rules to control man's evil nature. Left by himself, men will not do the right thing because the devil is everywhere and not all people are saved. So there were lots of, I'll talk more about this later, but lots of different rules for different things. For example, blasphemy, taking the Lord's name in vain. That was a serious crime. We'll talk more about the sexual crimes later. Cursing or disobeying a parent was a serious crime, and it didn't make a difference how old you were. Many of these people lived into their 70s and 80s, so you could be a 50-year-old man with your own household and your own farm, but you obeyed your mother and father. And it was a crime punishable with fines or a public whipping if you didn't. And this was done. There are cases on the books. The state, the government, was there to enforce God's laws, the Ten Commandments and other laws as well. So that's the basis of Puritan theology, Puritan religion, the basic tenets of it. Now, of course, you can immediately see there's some serious problems with this religion. This is why nobody believes in predestination anymore. If you are a godly person, if you are trying to be saved, how can you lead your life in a goodly way, in a godly way, if the world is largely corrupt, particularly since you can't tell from their actions who is good and who is bad, because what you did in life made no difference if you were predestined. Who do you hang out with? You never know. You're never sure. Predestination, by definition, is an incredibly pessimistic belief, full of anxiety, and they write their diaries. These people were literate. Their diaries are full of angst. They're constantly worried about, oh my God, what's happening to me? Am I going to be saved? A lot of depression in this society. High rate of suicide, high rate of depression. Not surprisingly. Most men were born evil. The assumption was you were evil and you're going to fry in hell. That would not create a very optimistic society. If this is true, why bother doing good things? Why bother getting up in the morning? If you are probably going to rot in hell, why bother? Just go find a bridge and jump off. It's not worth it. The part that predestination didn't highlight was the basic tenet of Christianity, that Christ died for all men's sins and gave us all the possibility of salvation. Puritans are looking at Adam and Eve, and we are all born sinful because Adam disobeyed God's commandment. Although they are Christians, they do believe in Christ. The solution was very quickly covenant theology. Again, this is unique to the Puritans, not in other Calvinists or even in other Protestants. If a covenant is a contract, and what the Puritans had to do when they came to America is soften their religion, because nobody can live like that. Nobody can live with the assumption that no matter what I do, I'm going to go to hell, so why bother in the morning? So what they did was create a contract. They thought their own contract with God, and they softened Calvinism. You could do good works if you led a good life, if you were a godly person, charitable, good to your neighbors, etc., etc. You would probably be among the saved. You would probably attain salvation. Good works were probably an indication of God's grace, but you never know, is the catch to that. So instead of being completely hopeless, people are trying to prove to themselves and prove to others that I'm really a godly person and I'm a good person, because that would show that you were one of God's elect. He had elected you to salvation. As the colony grows, it's harder to keep non-Puritans out. You have a lot more and more people who are not Puritans, and the children of Puritans and their grandchildren were not quite as religious or occupied with a religion morning, noon, and night as their elders, so they had to soften it. They made a contract with God, a covenant. And if they set up a good society in Massachusetts, if they were good and righteous Calvinists, then God would reward them, he would send them to heaven, and he would also give them prosperity. It was a contract. We will worship you in the right way, and God will reward us. Now, because there's problems with this, almost immediately, people start kicking back. Again, this is Protestantism. Anybody can interpret the religion their own way. So what happened is, if you look down, you will see a very charming, lovely guy. This was Roger Williams. According to Puritans and Calvinists, salvation was a gift of God. You did not earn it. But immediately, people began to interpret that their own way. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, very quickly, within 15 years of when Massachusetts is founded, kick back against this theology, and the result is both of them are exiled and thrown out of the colony. Puritans were not very tolerant. Myth, America was founded for religious freedom. Yes and no. There's no black and white in American society, in American history. Yes, but the Puritans were, if anything, more intolerant than the Anglicans in England. As one Puritan minister said, we came to America to worship our religion. Others can go elsewhere to worship theirs. They did not want non-Puritans, unpure people in Massachusetts society. So what Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson began to talk about was a different version. Roger Williams, that very charming, lovely, peaceful looking guy, early settler, early minister. He was called a living saint by other people in Massachusetts. Even his enemies adored him. He was, as one other minister said, the sweetest soul I ever knew, but a total religious fanatic. I'm quoting from Roger Williams. I infer that the sovereign, original, and foundation of civil power lies in the people. Government, he said, came from the people and not God and not the elders in the church. Who determines what you do? He said, the society, Puritan government, Massachusetts government cannot tell me what to do, because it could tell me the wrong thing. If all people are fallible, government may be wrong too. The only thing that determines my actions is God's direction. So this sweet, loving guy immediately starts causing problems. He withdrew. He was a minister. He gave up his congregation. He withdrew from the church. He begins to hang out only with himself and his wife. His children are grown, because he doesn't know, he can't tell if anybody else is saved or not. He only knows that he probably has salvation because he is following God's directions. The other ministers in Massachusetts got together. This is heresy. You can't have people deciding what rules they're going to follow and what rules they're not going to follow, because Roger Williams refused to follow the government of Massachusetts. He did not stop. They put him under a death sentence. Another minister, a close friend of his, this is in the middle of the winter, warns him. And he says, they're coming after you. They're going to take you back to England, put you on trial. That's a death sentence. Even if you're in a prison for 3 years, that's also a death sentence. So Roger Williams leaves his wife, leaves his home, flees in a blizzard. He is ill. He is sick at the same time. And he goes to the Indians. The Indians took him in. Massachusetts society threw him out. The Native Americans took him in, took care of him, nursed him back to health. What Roger Williams wants is total separation of church and state. Can't have that in Massachusetts because the laws of Massachusetts are laws dictated by the Bible, so he goes downstream a little bit towards the Narragansett Bay, founds a new colony called Rhode Island, after a Dutch word. The Dutch were the first there. And in Rhode Island, because he had been persecuted in Massachusetts, there is total religious freedom. Total religious freedom. So yes and no, America was founded for religious freedom. In Rhode Island, anyone can practice whatever they want. Native American religions, there were no atheists as far as I know at the time. Jews, there were almost no Muslims, but you could practice any religion you wanted. Anglican, Calvinist, Lutheran, whatever. And the society was governed, again, town by town, but not by those church members, but by landowners. Anybody who had property could vote. Roger Williams, because of his very good relationship with Native Americans, always treated Native Americans very well, made sure he had land bought by treaty, did not rip them off, did not antagonize and kill Native Americans. He had learned their language. He had studied their cultures. He was used to help broker problems between Massachusetts and Native Americans as well. So this is the first place in the world, one of the few places in the world where there is total religious freedom, Rhode Island, and it's very early, about 1635 or so. Also the first place in the world to outlaw slavery. Slavery was totally illegal because if every man has a soul, we are all equal in the eyes of gods. So any witches that were persecuted in Massachusetts immediately know where to go. They went down to Rhode Island. Roger Williams' first child he named Freeborn, very symbolic. His books, widely read in Britain, burned in America because they were heresy. They were against the teachings of the established church. Until he was 80 years old, and he died at 80. He spoke, he wrote. At the age of 70, he canoed by himself 20 miles down the river to debate 3 Quakers in Pennsylvania by himself for 10 hours. He spoke and debated them and argued for freedom of religion. So you want freedom of religion, Rhode Island, not Massachusetts. The other person with the same idea is a woman, which was very rare at the time. And if you read The Scarlet Letter, Hester Prynne is modeled after Anne Hutchinson. This is the well-educated daughter of a radical British minister. Strict Calvinist. She, in Britain, before she came to America, would walk or ride a horse 40 miles each way on a Sunday to hear ministers talk. She migrates with her husband and a bunch of kids to Massachusetts in 1634. She ended up having 15 kids. Excellent mother, only again lost 1 child out of 15, which was very rare at the time, and a skilled midwife. Midwife, we're going to talk about later, is a very hazardous occupation. Remember, there's no science. If the child had any problems, the assumption was the midwife was a witch and destroyed the child. Like Roger Williams, she rejects the authority of the church. It is only your conscience. God talks directly to you. He does not need the church to talk to. That smacked a little bit of Catholicism for Williams and Hutchinson. She begins to hold doctrine classes in her home and teach other classes for women. She's so good at this that pretty soon men start coming to listen to her sermons as well. Pretty soon she has groups of 60 to 80 people in the town square that she is teaching her own ideas to. Individual conscience over church authority. She had a great gift for making salvation understandable, for making salvation approachable for all. She made it a much softer religion. Pretty soon, some of her followers are following her teachings and saying, I don't have to follow the church rules. I don't have to join the local militia. I don't have to drill. I don't have to follow all the laws. Not surprisingly, 3 years after she shows up, she's put on trial for heresy by a council of ministers. While this is going on, you've got a couple of slides there, a couple of paintings we have of her. There are no drawings of her. She is 7 months pregnant and has a whole bunch of kids at home. The best religious minds in Massachusetts for 2 whole days debate her, put her on trial, and she out-argues them all. She knows the Bible better than they do. If they quote a passage from the Bible, she quotes another one back to them. Basically, what you have here is a very intelligent woman with an iron backbone, which is always a dangerous thing in that society. They finally convict her. You can see what's going on here. This is a quote from the actual court documents. We are your judges and not you ours. We do not mean to talk with those of your sex, woman. She had a haughty and fierce carriage, a nimble wit and an active spirit, and a very voluble tongue, more bold than a man, though in understanding and judgment inferior to many women, because she was not obedient, clearly. They finally catch her. How do they catch her? I listen only to God, she said. I don't have to listen to civilian authority. And the catch here, the catch 22 was, how do you know it's God? How are the voices in your head to be proven to be God? You can't prove it. Who else could it be? It could be the devil. He has many ways of changing forms and misleading people. How did the Puritans control for this? Ministers. This was the role of ministers, to make sure people stayed on the godly path and did not stray into the devil's ways. If you're by yourself, it is much easier for the devil to mislead you. She is banished. She takes her last 4 youngest children. She moves to Rhode Island. Her husband has died by this time. Later on, she moves to southern New York, and she is slaughtered a few years later by the Indians with her youngest 4 children. So one of the greatest intellectual minds in New England is slaughtered by Indians because she was banished. But you can see what happens to Puritan religion. Almost immediately, it becomes challenged. It's very, very difficult to be a really devout Puritan. This is a hard life. So next time we will talk about Puritan society, Puritan families, Puritan culture. If you have these basic religious tenets, their society is set up to honor the same rules. Take care.